Magic the Gathering is a trading card game that offers tactical gameplay, epic world building, and a passionate community of players across the globe. In Magic, you and your opponent take on the role of powerful dueling wizards, hurling devastating spells and summoning creatures to fight by your sides. Those spells and creatures are represented by cards, and each player uses their own unique deck shaped around their personal tastes and strategies. The game is played in turns, and your goal is to take your opponent's life total from 20 all the way down to 0. No two games play out the same, and the strategies available to you are endless. In Magic, there are 5 colors, each with its own benefits and strengths. Red mages channel fire, lightning, and aggression, destroying their foes with massive dragons. Blue mages are adaptable like water, tricking their opponents with illusions and mind magic. Black commands spells of darkness and death, raising hordes of zombies and demons, while white heals and protects, rallying vast armies of well-trained soldiers. Finally, green taps into the power of nature and the primal strength of wild beasts. Learning to play Magic is a rich and rewarding experience, so today we're here to guide you, one step at a time, through everything you need to sit down and play the greatest strategy game ever made. To start things off, we're going to teach you just one concept that's central to the entire game of Magic: how to cast a spell. There's a lot more to learn, but trust us, once you master this, the rest of the game becomes much easier to understand. Cards in Magic the Gathering fall into 2 categories: lands and spells. It's not hard to tell the difference. Look at the top right corner of the card. Spells will have 1 or more symbols here, while lands will not. Lands also have the word land on the middle of the card, right here. So what's the difference between lands and spells? In general, spells are the cards that actually do things in-game. They can be anything from fireballs and lightning bolts that strike down enemies, to monsters that can attack your opponents and defend you from threats. Lands, on the other hand, act as a resource. They produce a magical energy called mana. You can think of mana as being a bit like money. All spells have a cost, and mana is what you use to pay those costs. The colors of mana match the 5 colors of Magic we discussed earlier: white, blue, black, red, and green, and each is represented by a different symbol. So different lands make different colors of mana. Now check out the card Savannah Lions. This is a creature spell. We'll go over how creatures work later, but what's important right now is that it's a spell. Like all spells, it has those symbols in the top right corner. This is the card's mana cost, and if you want to cast this spell, you have to pay that cost. Now, see the symbol in this circle? This is the white mana symbol. It matches up with the symbol on this land card, a plains. That tells you that this plains can pay the cost of the Savannah Lions and allow you to cast it. To do so, just take the land and turn it sideways, like so. This is called tapping the card. It's a way to indicate that it has been used for this turn. When you do that, you create the 1 white mana that is needed to pay the cost of the Savannah Lions. And just like that, you've cast your first spell. Congratulations, you're a wizard! Creatures like Savannah Lions are what we call permanents. They stick around on the battlefield after they're cast. You don't need to pay their mana cost again to use them on future turns. It's a one-time payment. Don't worry too much about what the card actually does right now. That'll come later. Let's try another spell with a mana cost that's a little bit more complex. Check out Coral Commando. This card's cost has more than 1 symbol on it: a gray circle with the number 2 and a blue water droplet, the symbol for blue mana, which comes from islands. When there are multiple symbols like this in the cost of a card, I want you to imagine that there is an invisible plus sign between each symbol, so you need to pay this plus that. The blue mana symbol matches up with this island land card, so that tells you that you need 1 blue mana from that island to pay for that part of the cost, just like you needed white mana from a plains to pay the white mana last time. But the symbol with the 2 in it is a little different. To pay this part of the cost, you need 2 mana. But that mana can be of any color, so it doesn't matter if you use a plains, an island, or any other land. That means to cast this spell, you will need 1 blue mana plus 2 more mana of any color. So you'll need 3 mana total to play this card. This combined number is known as the card's mana value. Basically, mana value is the total amount of mana you will need to cast the spell, which again in this case is 3. More expensive spells are bigger and more powerful, but their mana costs still work in the same way. For instance, This big gorilla has a gray circle with a 3 in it, plus 2 green mana symbols. So how much mana total do you think you will need to cast this baddie? What is its mana value? If you said 5, you're correct. But in this case, 2 of that 5 mana must be green, like this. Yeah, that thing is scary. Okay, let's do a quick thought exercise. I want you to try and figure out how to cast some spells on your own. Let's imagine you have these 3 lands in play, and in your hand you have 3 spells. Which of these cards can you cast right now? Remember, the gray numbers can be paid with any kind of mana, but the colored symbols must match the color of the land you use. And don't forget the invisible plus sign between each symbol. If you said Goblin Raiders, you're correct. You can cast it by tapping 1 mountain land to produce 1 red mana and either one of your other lands. You cannot cast this spell because it unfortunately needs at least 1 blue mana, which you don't have. And likewise, you can't cast this one because its total mana value is 4, but you've only got 3 lands available. All right, let's try one more, just to make sure you really have the concept down. Here are your 3 spells, but this time you've got 4 lands. So what can you play? If you said either of these 2 cards, you're correct. This card requires 2 white mana plus 1 of any color. And this spell takes mana from 1 plains plus 1 island plus 2 lands of any color. The only spell you can't cast is this one. Because even though you have the island you need, you require 5 other lands to pay the rest of the cost, but you only have 3 left. You'll run into a lot of situations where there's more than 1 spell that you can cast. Figuring out which is the best choice in any given situation, well, that's where the strategy comes in. Magic is a game that really rewards smart decision making and player skill. So now you've learned how to cast a spell and summon vicious beasts to fight at your side. But how exactly does that fighting actually work? That answer is coming up next in Chapter 2.
As we mentioned before, in Magic, your goal is to take your opponent's life total from 20 all the way down to 0. And one of the best and most fun ways to do that is combat. So in this chapter, we're gonna teach you the ins and outs of how to engage in creature combat. You already saw some creature cards when you learned how to cast spells, but now let's look at a creature in a little more detail. In the bottom right corner of every creature card, you'll see 2 numbers separated by a slash. The first number is that creature's power. This represents how much damage that creature can dish out in combat. Basically, how hard it can hit. The second number is that creature's toughness. This represents how much damage that creature can take before it dies. You can think of it as its health. So this card, Coral Commando, has a power of 3. That means it can deal 3 damage in combat. Its toughness is 2, meaning if it takes 2 or more damage, it'll die. Because this creature has 3 power and 2 toughness, most players would call it a 3/2. Now let's put power and toughness into practice by going into combat. When you attack with a creature, you're sending that creature to attack your opponent directly. It is important to note, creatures cannot attack other creatures. Creatures can only attack players. This doesn't mean that creatures don't battle each other though. It's just up to your opponent to decide whether their creatures will protect them from your attacks. So in order to attack, you must turn your creature sideways, tapping it. It's the same general idea you saw with lands when casting your spells. The act of tapping a card shows you're using that card, in this case, to attack. Now, your 3/2 Coral Commando is attacking your opponent. If they have no creatures, the commando will get straight through and hit the opponent for 3 damage to their life total, taking them from 20 to 17. Okay, let's rewind. How would that attack have gone if your opponent had a creature of their own? This staunch Shieldmate, which has 1 power and 3 toughness, making it a 1/3. Let's attack the opponent again. Now they have a choice. Just because they can block doesn't mean they have to. And if they don't, they'll take 3 damage like before. But now let's suppose they do choose to block your commando with their creature. Now that the blocking decisions have been made, it's time for the creatures to deal damage to each other. Attacking creatures and blocking creatures deal damage based on their power, and they deal that damage at the exact same time. In this case, your commando has 3 power, so it will deal 3 damage to their shieldmate. Meanwhile, their shieldmate has 1 power, so it will deal 1 damage to your commando. Your commando has been dealt 1 damage, but it has 2 toughness. Since 1 is less than 2, your creature survives. But your opponent's shieldmate is not so lucky. It was dealt 3 damage, and its toughness is 3. That means it's been dealt exactly enough damage to kill it. So it will die, going to your opponent's graveyard, which is Magic's term for the discard pile. Now let's rewind again and see what would have happened if you attacked with a bigger creature, like this card, Frenzied Raptor. As you can see, this creature has 4 power and 2 toughness. In this case, the raptor deals 4 damage to their shieldmate. What's important to note here is even though your attacking creature's power 4 was greater than their blocking creature's toughness 3, our opponent still takes no damage because the attack was blocked. Excess damage does not spill over, so their shieldmate will die and that's it. Basically, whenever an attacking creature becomes blocked, that means it won't hit your opponent no matter how high the power is. Even if a huge creature with 10 power were blocked by a tiny creature with 1 toughness, the defending player would take no damage. Now let's look at a few more possibilities of how things can go. Imagine their staunch shieldmate had been tapped instead. If a creature is tapped, it cannot block. So putting their shieldmate in front of our attacker wouldn't even be an option. And remember, whenever you attack with a creature, you have to tap it. That means it won't be available to block until your next turn. So be careful out there. Now your opponent's tapped shieldmate can't block, but they do have this untapped Centaur Courser, which has 3 power and 3 toughness, and they choose to block with it. So what happens now? Your raptor deals 4 damage to their centaur, and at the same time, their centaur deals 3 damage to your raptor. In this case, both creatures were dealt enough damage to destroy them, so both will die at the same time and go to their owner's graveyards. This kind of scenario where both the attacking creature and the blocking creature die is often called a trade. Both you and your opponent lost a creature in the exchange. Now let's look at one more example. Again, you attacked with your raptor, but this time your opponent blocked with a siege mastodon. This mighty elephant of theirs has 3 power and 5 toughness. The mastodon survives because its toughness, 5, is greater than the damage it was dealt, 4. Your raptor, however, was dealt 3 damage and dies, going to your graveyard. Attacking there might have been a bad idea. Now we're gonna look at one last one-on-one combat scenario, but this time, your creature has an ability. This is Moss Viper, a 1 power, 1 toughness creature with an ability called Death Touch. Death Touch means any amount of damage this creature deals to another creature is enough to kill it, no matter what the other creature's toughness is. Let's say you attacked with this Viper and your opponent blocked with that Siege Mastodon. Both creatures deal damage to each other, and then what happens? Your creature was dealt 3 damage, so it will die. Now their Mastodon was only dealt 1 damage, which is way less than its toughness. But because your creature has Death Touch, the Mastodon will die too. A pretty good trade. Death Touch is just one of many abilities creatures can have in Magic, and as you can see, it's a very useful way to turn the tides of combat in your favor. Now, we've looked at a lot of possible scenarios involving 1 attacker and 1 blocker, but in Magic, there are often many creatures on the battlefield. So now, you're going to attack your opponent with Frenzied Raptor again, but this time, they have 2 creatures. The 1/3 Staunch Shieldmate we saw earlier, and this Sanctuary Cat, which has 1 power and 2 toughness, making it a 1/2. Now, your opponent has a few options. First, of course, they could simply choose not to block and take 4 damage to their life total. Second, they could choose to block with just one of their 2 creatures. In either case, though, their creature would die and yours would survive. That doesn't sound great for them. But now, they have a third option. They can block your raptor with both of their creatures. In Magic, an attacking creature can be blocked by any number of creatures. Now, let's see what happens when their creatures work together. First, your opponent declares that they plan to block your attacker with both of their creatures. Then you, the attacking player, get to decide how the raptor will divvy up its damage. To do this, you put the blocking creatures in whatever order you choose. That will tell the raptor how to prioritize. With your 4 power against their 5 total toughness, you have enough damage to kill 1 blocker but not both. Their shieldmate has better stats though, so let's prioritize that one first. Your raptor will try to assign enough damage to kill what's in front. Then it'll do the same for the next blocker. So let's see how this plays out here. And remember, damage between creatures is dealt all at the same time, even when there are multiple blockers. Your raptor has 4 power, meaning it has 4 damage to divvy up. So 3 of that damage goes on the shieldmate, enough to kill it, and 1 damage goes on the cat. Meanwhile, both blocking creatures deal damage to your raptor. They have a combined power of 2, so the raptor is going down as well. At the end of the day, the cat stands alone. Now, a player can block with as many untapped creatures as they have, but the same basic concepts still apply whether there's 1 blocker, 2 blockers, or even 20. But just like you can block with more than 1 creature, you can also attack with more than 1 creature. So let's walk through an example of that. One important thing to note first is, when you want to attack with multiple creatures, they do it at the same time. You can't attack with one, see what your opponent does, then attack with another. Basically, after you've declared your attacks, you're committed. No takesies, backsies, or changes based on your opponent's blocks. Alright, now let's say you're attacking with both of these 2 frenzied raptors here. If your opponent has exactly 1 untapped creature, they could choose to block either of your raptors or neither of them, but not both. 1 creature cannot block multiple attackers. It can't be in 2 places at once. But now let's say your opponent has 2 untapped creatures. In that case, their choices multiply quite a bit. They could choose not to block. They could block 1 or both with a single creature each. Or they could even double block one of them. This level of choice can look a little daunting, but once you get the hang of it, figuring out attacks and blocks is one of the most strategically rewarding parts of the game. Okay, now that you've got the gist of things, let's try some exercises to reinforce it. First, let's look at this scenario. You've attacked with 2 creatures, and your opponent has blocked each of those attackers with 1 creature of their own. What will be the outcome of this combat after the damage is dealt? Alright, let's see what happens. The 3-2 Commando and the 4-2 Raptor both deal enough damage to kill each other. They traded. Meanwhile, neither the bear nor the shieldmate did enough damage to kill the other, so they'll both just stay on the battlefield. At the end of combat, the board would look like this. Did you get it? Now let's try an exercise that puts you in the driver's seat on offense. Look at this board. As you can see, our opponent's life total is down to just 3. We have a 7-6 and a 3-1, while they have a 4-4 that's untapped. The question is, how could you attack to win the game this combat? The answer is, you attack with both. Let's look at why. If you attack with just your 3-1 Raptor, they're definitely going to block with their 4-4, and your creature will die. That's not gonna do it. So what if we attack with just the 7-6 Worm? If they block, their creature will die. But if they don't, they'll lose the game. So they're definitely going to block. But remember, even though your worm's power is bigger than their blocker's toughness, the excess damage doesn't spill over, so this attack doesn't win the game either. But if you attack with both creatures, your opponent can only block 1. Sure, they could kill the 3-1, but that doesn't matter when you get to win the game. Let's try one more exercise to get into some blocking strategy. You're being attacked by this 3-3 Centaur and this 1-1 Wizard. And this time, you are at 3 life. Looking at your board, you have these 2 bears, each of which is a 2-2. The question here is simple. What do you think you should do? We'll give you a second and then start breaking it down. Alright, let's go through it. First of all, if you don't block, or only block the 1-1, you lose the game, because the Centaur hits for 3 all by itself. That means you're down to just a few viable choices. First, you could put one of your bears in front of their 3-3 Centaur. In this case, after damage is dealt, they'll still have both of their creatures, while one of yours will die, and your life total will go down to 2. Your second option is to block each of their attackers with one of your bears. In this case, you both lose 1 creature, but the creature they get to keep is bigger than yours, which isn't great. Your third choice here is to put both of the bears in front of the Centaur. In this case, you take out their biggest threat and still get to keep one of your bears. Sure, you take the 1 damage from the unblocked wizard, but that's okay, you're still alive. So let's take a look at all 3 of these outcomes side by side. In the first, they still have 2 creatures and you're down to just 1. In the second, they have a 3-3, you have a 2-2, and we didn't take any damage. Then in the third, you have a 2-2 while they only have a 1-1, and you went down to 2 life. So looking at it like this, option 3 is the winner. But we're just scratching the surface here. One of the greatest things about Magic is just how deep the strategy goes. Any one of those scenarios could have been correct, depending on the cards in your hand or your overall game plan. Finally, let's go through a couple common questions newer players can have about combat. Question 1. When I block with my creature, do I have to tap it? No. Your creature must be untapped in order to block. But unlike attacking, blocking does not tap your creature, so it'll stay untapped. Question 2. If my creature was already tapped, can I still attack with it? No, your creature must start untapped so that you can tap it when you attack with it. Okay, so now you know the basics of how combat works, but when does it actually happen in a game of Magic? And how does the rest of the turn go? You're about to find out in Chapter 3.
By now, you've learned to cast a spell and handle combat. It's time to put everything together and learn how to start playing. We're going to run you through a simple example game, just to give you an idea of what playing Magic actually looks like. To start, you and your opponent both choose your decks, shuffle each of them up so the cards are completely randomized, and then draw 7 cards each. Now these 7 cards are called your opening hand, and they'll have a big impact on how your first couple of turns play out. Luckily, if you don't like your opening hand, you can draw a new 7 cards. We call this taking a mulligan. Don't worry, these aren't the only cards you'll see. Each player also gets to draw 1 new card at the beginning of each of their turns, with the notable exception of the very first turn of the game. Okay, let's jump into it. For this game, you'll be going first. You and your opponent have each drawn your opening 7 card hands, so it's time to start the first turn. As we mentioned before, the first player does not draw a card on the first turn of the game, so you'll be working with the 7 cards you have at the moment. As you know, you'll need some lands if you want to cast any of your spells. So let's play this plains from your hand onto the battlefield. Each player is allowed to play 1, and only 1, land from their hand on each of their turns. So even though you have a couple more lands in your hand, you'll have to wait until later to play them. With a land in play, you have what you need to start casting spells. Just like before, you can tap your plains to create 1 white mana. Then use that mana to cast the card Savannah Lions from your hand onto the battlefield. For a creature, being summoned is disorienting, so they need some time to adjust before they can really do much. This is called summoning sickness. In rules terms, this means after casting a creature, you can't tap it to use it for anything until your next turn. Normally, you'd have a chance to attack your opponent here, but look at this lion. He's not feeling well enough to attack anyone. Because attacking requires you to tap the creature, summoning sickness will stop the lions from attacking this turn. It's important to note, summoning sickness only applies to creatures, so you can tap lands and other cards the same turn they come down. For now though, with a summoning sick lion and no more lands to tap for mana, there's nothing else we can do. So it's time to end our turn. Now your opponent gets to take their turn. Since this isn't the very first turn of the game, they'll start by drawing a card from their deck. Then they're working with the same rules you were. They, like you, are also only allowed to play 1 land each turn. In this case, they play an island. Then they tap it to make 1 blue mana, and spend that mana to play a fugitive wizard. Remember, that creature has summoning sickness, so you don't have to worry about them attacking you this turn. With that finished, your opponent passes the turn back to you. For your second turn, it's time to go into a little more detail about the exact order of steps you'll go through on a typical turn. Every turn starts off with untapping everything you have in play. That means all your lands, creatures, and anything else you used last turn will refresh, and you have a chance to use them again this turn. Also, any of your creatures with summoning sickness will become healthy and ready to go. This is called the untap step. This would have happened on your first turn too, you just didn't have anything in play to untap. Next comes the draw step. As we mentioned before, you draw a card every turn, except for the first player's first turn of the game. Looks like the card you drew is Flame Slash. After your draw step comes what is called the first main phase. This is the part of the game where you're allowed to play your 1 land and cast the spells from your hand. The first main phase is when we played our plains and cast our lion last turn. This turn, let's play a mountain as our land for a turn. That way you have access to the red mana you need to cast the new Flame Slash card you just drew. Flame Slash is a type of spell called a sorcery, as shown right here on the card. Unlike creatures, which stick around on the battlefield after you cast them, sorceries do a one-time effect that happens right when you cast the card. Then, unlike lands or creatures, they immediately go to your graveyard. Flame Slash deals 4 damage to a creature, which is plenty to kill your opponent's fugitive wizard. Let's do that now. Just tap your mountain to make 1 red mana, and cast Flame Slash, targeting their creature as you cast it. Boom! Your flames toast that wizard. Then Flame Slash goes right to your graveyard. Its job is done. If you have the mana and cards available, you can cast as many spells as you want in your first main phase. But as you may have guessed from the name, your first main phase isn't your last chance to cast those spells on your turn. So even though we have enough mana available to cast this Rustwing Falcon from our hand, let's hold off for the moment, and instead move to the next phase of the turn, combat. We learned about this in Chapter 2, but now let's see it in action. Last turn, Savannah Lions couldn't attack because it had summoning sickness, but now it's raring to go. The first thing that happens in combat is you declare which creatures you want to attack with. So let's attack your opponent with the lion, tapping it to show that it's attacking. If you had any other creatures you wanted to attack with, you would also choose to do so now. As you may remember, you have to declare all your attacking creatures at the same time. Now, your opponent would have a chance to block, but since you already destroyed their only creature, your Savannah Lions goes unblocked, taking them from 20 life down to 18. Not a bad start. After damage is dealt, combat is over, and the turn moves on to your second main phase. Just like your first main phase, this is an opportunity to cast spells, and if you haven't already done so for the turn, play a land. For your second main phase, let's cast another spell. You have one untapped plane still available, which is just enough to play this Rustwing Falcon from your hand. Because it's a creature, Rustwing Falcon has summoning sickness this turn, just like Savannah Lions did last turn. It often makes sense to save creature spells you want to cast until your second main phase, since they won't be able to participate in combat that turn anyway. It's important to note, your main phases are the only times when you're allowed to play lands and cast creatures or sorceries. But after casting Rustwing Falcon, you don't have any more untapped lands available, so there's nothing else you can do. Magic players often call this being tapped out, but your turn's not over yet. There's one more phase, and it's called the end step. There are a couple of important things that happen on the end step of your turn. First, if you have 8 or more cards in your hand, you have to discard cards until you only have 7 left. This is because 7 is your maximum hand size. Maximum hand size only matters at the end of your turn. So if you go above 7 cards in your hand, you don't need to discard down to 7 right away. You have until the end of your turn to play those cards. Right now, you've got fewer than 7 cards in your hand, so there's no need to discard anything on this end step. Also during the end step, effects that say until end of turn come to an end, and damage is removed from creatures, both of which we'll show you examples of later in the chapter. With that, your second turn is complete. Now, we move on to your opponent's second turn. Just like every turn, they start by untapping everything they have in play and drawing a card. On their first main phase, they play another island as their land for turn, and tap it, creating the 1 blue mana needed to cast Aegis Turtle, a 0 power, 5 toughness creature they can use to block. Like all creatures on the turn you cast them, the turtle has summoning sickness, so your opponent will pass right through their combat step without attacking. For their second main phase, your opponent has nothing left they want to do, so they simply go to their end step and pass the turn back to you. You probably noticed they still have 1 land untapped. They might just have nothing in their hand they want to cast for the 1 remaining mana, or everything in their hand could be too expensive to play. You aren't required to use all your available mana in a turn. Now it's your turn again. As always, you start by untapping everything you have in play and drawing a card. Next comes your first main phase. We'll start off by playing a plains as your 1 land for turn. That gives you 3 mana to work with. Now let's play this card from your hand. Ethereal Guidance. Just like Flame Slash, Ethereal Guidance is a sorcery, so its effects will happen 1 time when you cast it, then it'll go to your graveyard. Let's look at what the card does. Ethereal Guidance says, creatures you control get +2/+1 until end of turn. Notice how instead of targeting one specific creature like Flame Slash did, Ethereal Guidance automatically affects all of your creatures. In this case, it gives each of them 2 extra power and 1 extra toughness for just this turn. So your Rustwing Falcon is now a 3/2, and your Savannah Lions is a 4/2. That's a nice little boost for your growing army. Once you cast Ethereal Guidance, it goes to your graveyard just like all sorceries, but as it says on the card, the changes to your creature's stats stick around until the end of your turn. None of your newly buffed creatures currently have summoning sickness, so let's see what happens if you decide to attack with both your Savannah Lions and your Rustwing Falcon. Remember, you have to declare all of your attacking creatures at the same time. Last turn, you got rid of your opponent's creature before combat, so they couldn't block anything if they wanted to. But this turn, they have an untapped Aegis Turtle in play. With 5 toughness, the turtle is pretty good at blocking most creatures you could throw at it. But let's take a closer look at Rustwing Falcon. You probably noticed your Falcon has an ability called Flying. Flying is a common ability that makes a creature more difficult to block in combat. A creature with flying can only be blocked by another creature with flying. But on defense, flyers can block ground creatures if you want them to. This makes pretty logical sense. If a turtle was trying to stop a bird from attacking someone in real life, it wouldn't really have much of a chance since the bird can just fly over the top of it. This sort of scenario happens far more often in Magic than real life though, so it's worth explaining. There are many other abilities like this that can change how combat works, but flying is one of the most common ones you'll encounter. This means your opponent cannot block your Falcon, but they can block your Savannah Lions, which is what they choose to do. Note that even though their turtle still has summoning sickness, it is able to block, because blocking does not require it to tap. Once blockers have been chosen, all damage is dealt at the same time. Savannah Lions does 4 damage to the Aegis Turtle, who does no damage in return due to its 0 power, while your opponent takes 3 damage from your Rustwing Falcon, taking their life total down to 15. Then comes your second main phase. You already played your land this turn and you're tapped out, so you can't cast any more spells. Instead, we'll move right to the end step. Your end step works exactly like it did last turn. If you have more than 7 cards in hand, you'll have to discard down to 7, but you've only got 2. Now, any effects that last until end of turn come to an end. This turn, that means the effect of your Ethereal Guidance wears off, and your creatures go back to their original power and toughness. Also, as we mentioned earlier, damage is removed from creatures. So let's take a look at your opponent's Aegis Turtle. In combat, it took 4 damage from your Lions. Players would say it had 4 damage marked on it, but damage doesn't stay on creatures forever. In fact, all creatures heal back to normal at the end of each turn. So now with your turn complete, the 4 damage is removed from Aegis Turtle, leaving it hale and hearty and ready to block another day. From here, the game would continue back and forth with you and your opponent casting spells, attacking with creatures, and trying to take each other's life totals down to 0. But the basic structure of the turn will always be the same. Let's go over the order of a turn one more time to really drive it home. First, untap everything on your board. Then, draw a card, except on the first player's first turn. Next comes the first main phase, where you can cast spells and play your 1 land for turn, followed by combat, which proceeds in this order. Active player declares attackers, defending player declares blockers, then all damage is dealt at once. After combat comes your second main phase, another opportunity to cast spells or play a land if you haven't already played one. Then finally, the end step, where you discard down to 7 cards if necessary, end any effects that last until end of turn, and remove all damage from all creatures. Alright, let's try a couple of exercises, just to really drive home some of the concepts we went over in this chapter. It's the beginning of your turn. You've already untapped and drawn a card, which means it's your first main phase. So far, you've played nothing from your hand. Which of the spells in your hand could you cast this turn? If you said Alpine Watchdog or Centaur Courser, you're correct. You could choose to cast either of these this turn. For Alpine Watchdog, it's easy. You already have 2 lands out, so all you need to do is tap them for mana. To cast Centaur Courser, you'll need to first play a land from your hand. But that's no problem because it's your first main phase and you have 2 in hand. Imperial Outrider, however, you cannot play this turn. You would need to have 2 more lands out in order to afford its mana cost. Even though you have 2 lands in hand, you can only play 1 of them per turn, so you won't be able to cast this until next turn. Let's look at another scenario. You have 2 cards in hand, Runeclaw Bear and Erratic Visionary, both of which have a mana value of 2. You have 3 lands in play and it's already your first main phase, so you won't be drawing any more cards. On the battlefield, you have a creature you played last turn which we haven't seen before, Civic Gardener. It reads, whenever Civic Gardener attacks, untap target creature or land. You haven't seen a creature with an ability like this before, but you have all the pieces you need to put together how it works. Now, if you wanted to play both of the cards from your hand this turn, how could you pull it off? Let's walk through the solution. In your first main phase, you only have 3 lands available to you. That's enough to cast either of the spells from your hand, but not both. So for now, let's cast one of them. That leaves you with only 1 untapped land. But this is where Civic Gardener's ability comes into play. Let's move to combat and attack with Civic Gardener. When you do, Civic Gardener lets you untap one of your tapped lands. That gives you enough to cast the other spell from your hand. Of course, you can't cast a creature spell during combat, so you'll have to wait until your second main phase. But then you can tap both of your untapped lands, letting you cast your second spell. This is just one example of how using every phase of the turn can help you maximize what you're able to do. At this point, you know the basic rules of the game. You're almost ready to start playing on your own. But before you do, it's time to learn a bit more about the different types of cards you'll encounter on your Magic journey in Chapter 4.
So, you've learned how to cast spells, engage in combat, and even how to actually take your turn. You know a lot about Magic's gameplay and rules at this point. So now, let's focus on the cards themselves. In Magic, cards are divided into different types, many of which you've already seen. A card's type is indicated on the type line here in the middle of the card. As you can see on these land cards, the type lines all have the word land. And on all these creature cards, we see the word creature. These are 2 of the types we refer to as permanents, meaning they stay on the battlefield after you play them. You already have a lot of experience with lands and creatures from previous chapters. But now, let's look at some types of permanents we haven't shown you yet. This is Glorious Anthem, and as you can see here on the type line, this card is an enchantment. When you cast an enchantment spell, it sticks around on the battlefield, because enchantments are also permanents. And like creatures and sorceries, they can only be cast during your main phases. Now, most enchantments have an ongoing effect on the game. This one, for instance, increases all of your creatures' power and toughness. So if you have a 1/3 and a 2/2 in play, and then you play Glorious Anthem, those creatures become a 2/4 and a 3/3 as long as the enchantment stays on the battlefield. And any new creatures you play afterwards will also get that passive boost from the enchantment. Now let's look at one more type of permanent. Artifacts. These are powerful tools and objects you can use to your advantage. And like other permanents, they remain in play once you cast them and can only be cast during your main phases. Many artifacts, including this Icy Manipulator, have special abilities you can use once they're on the battlefield. Let's figure out what this card does. When a card has a usable ability, or as we call it in Magic, an activated ability, you'll see a block of text that contains a colon, like this one. This part of the text before the colon is the ability's cost. It's what you have to pay in order to use it. And these costs work basically the same as a card's mana cost in the top right corner. Now this 1 in a gray circle is something that you're familiar with by now. It means you need to pay 1 mana of any color. This other symbol is called the tap symbol, and while you may not have seen this symbol just yet, you do know how tapping generally works. So here, the tap symbol means you must tap the Icy Manipulator itself and pay 1 mana in order to use its ability. Now, let's see what you get for it. This other text after the colon shows what the ability actually does. In this case, it taps something. So if your opponent has a pesky untapped creature threatening to block your big attack, this Icy Manipulator could tap it down, allowing you to get in there for damage, since tapped creatures can't block. One important thing to note is, non-creature artifacts do not have summoning sickness. In fact, creatures are the only type of card in Magic where summoning sickness applies. So you can activate this Icy Manipulator's ability the same turn you cast it, as long as you can afford it. But if the tap symbol appeared on a creature, like this Arbor Elf, you would not be able to use its ability the same turn you cast it, because it would have summoning sickness, which prevents tapping in this way. The types we just went through, lands, creatures, enchantments, and artifacts, are the most common kinds of permanents you'll encounter in Magic. But there are 2 other permanent types in the game called planeswalkers and battles. These are much less common and also have more rules surrounding them. So we recommend holding off on these until you've really mastered the basics. So now you've learned about every type of permanent in Magic, but not all card types are permanents. And you've already seen one example in the previous chapter. So let's talk about sorceries. As you've learned, sorceries are one-time effects. You cast the spell, its effect happens, and then the card goes to your graveyard. But just like with permanents, you can only cast sorcery spells during your own turn and only during one of your main phases. Now though, let's talk about the other type of non-permanent spell. And these are called instants. Like sorceries, instants are single use, but what makes instants unique is they're the only card type you can cast at any time you want, even on your opponent's turn. Let's see just how useful that can be with this instant card, Giant Growth. Check this out. You have a 2/2 Runeclaw bear. Now, it's your opponent's turn, and they don't like this bear much, so they cast Flame Slash on it. And here's the thing, there's a moment that exists in Magic after someone casts a spell or uses an ability, but before the spell or ability actually happens, or as Magic players say, before it resolves. Imagine, for instance, that a rival wizard is casting a fireball to hurl your way. There's gonna be a moment where you see the spell charging up before it actually gets launched. There, that's your chance to respond. And in Magic, that charging up moment exists for every spell and ability, giving players a chance to act at instant speed. So in this case, the 4 damage from the Flame Slash would be enough to kill your bear. But you have this Giant Growth in hand, an instant that reads, target creature gets +3/+3 until end of turn. So after your opponent announces they're casting Flame Slash, you say that before it resolves, you're casting Giant Growth targeting the bear. Because you're the one responding to them, your spell will happen or resolve first. That means the bear will go from a 2/2 to a 5/5. Then the Flame Slash will resolve and your bear will be dealt 4 damage. But now that it has 5 toughness, it survives. Remember though, instants can be cast at any time. Your opponent doesn't need to have done something for you to respond to. You can cast an instant proactively. In fact, let's look at an example, this time in combat. Remember in Chapter 2 when your Frenzied Raptor got double blocked by the shield mate and the cat? Let's bring that up again. You saw how this went last time, but now you have a card in hand called Shock, an instant that can deal 2 damage to anything you choose. So this time, after your opponent blocks with their creatures, but before the creatures actually deal damage, you're gonna cast Shock, targeting their cat. Now your opponent does have a chance to respond here. Even instant spells can be responded to with other instants, but it looks like they don't have anything. So the shock will resolve and its 2 damage will kill the cat, sending it to the graveyard. So now the creatures deal damage. Your raptor still kills their shield mate, but this time the raptor only takes 1 damage back, so it survives. This went way better than it did in Chapter 2. Now, instant spells aren't the only thing you can do at any time. You can use your card's activated abilities whenever you'd like as well. So let's look back at Icy Manipulator, the artifact we saw earlier. Its ability can also be used at any time. For example, you could use the Manipulator on your opponent's turn to tap their biggest creature before combat. That way, it won't be able to attack you. Remember, instants and activated abilities you can use whenever you like, but everything else, sorceries, creatures, artifacts, and enchantments, can be cast only during your own main phases, and not in response to other spells or abilities. And the same goes for playing your land each turn. And that's it! Now, let's try some exercises to reinforce what you've learned. First of all, which cards from among the ones on screen would stay on the battlefield after you cast them? The answer is Prized Griffin, Orcish Oriflame, and Prophetic Prism. This is because creatures, enchantments, and artifacts are all permanents, which stick around. Instants and sorceries, however, are not permanents. They're single use, so Titanic Growth and Night's Whisper would go straight to the graveyard. All right, let's get some practice with acting at instant speed. Take a look at this scenario. You have 2 Runeclaw bears, each of which is a 2/2, while your opponent only has a 1/1 fugitive wizard. You also have a giant growth in your hand and the untapped forest to cast it. And finally, but importantly, your opponent is down to 4 life. The question here is, how do you win the game this turn? Did you get it? Let's break down how it needs to be done. First, you have to attack with both creatures. If you only attack with one, they can just block it, which would mean they'd take no damage no matter how big the bear becomes. So, you've attacked with both, and your opponent is at 4 life. If they don't block, they'll just lose on the spot, so they have to block one of your creatures. But then, after they decide which bear to block, but before creatures deal damage, you cast your giant growth, pumping up the unblocked bear. That will turn it into a 5/5, so when it hits your opponent, they'll take enough damage to knock them out of the game. And in this case, you had to let everything play out in that order. Let's see why. Imagine you had cast Giant Growth first, then attacked. In this case, you're attacking with a 5/5 and a 2/2. They have to block your 5/5 in order to live. Then the end result is their creature will die and their life total will go down to 2. But 2 isn't 0. Things still look bad for them here, but they're alive. And that means they'll get a whole turn of their own to stage a comeback. And we'd rather not let that happen. For this final exercise, we're going to test a lot of what you've learned today by putting you on defense, fighting to survive. It's your opponent's first main phase of the turn, and they control 4 Coral Commandos, each of which is a 3/2. Now, you're down to just 3 life, so any one of those creatures could deal enough damage to kill you. To defend yourself, you have 2 1/3 Staunch Shieldmates and the Icy Manipulator we saw earlier, plus 2 untapped plains, 3 untapped mountains, and 4 cards in hand. 3 are cards you've seen before, Flame Slash, Shock, and Frenzied Raptor. The 4th, though, is Chaplain's Blessing, a sorcery that lets you gain life. The question is, what's your best move to stay in the game? Now, there's a whole lot to keep track of, so picking the single best course of action might seem tough, but the trick is, there's actually only one path that even keeps you alive. Tap, shock, and block. Let's break down why. In theory, any of the 4 cards in your hand could help out here by either killing your opponent's creatures, getting another blocker on the board, or increasing your life total. But the thing is, it's your opponent's turn, so the only card in your hand that you're allowed to cast right now is Shock, because it's an instant. The other cards can only be cast during a main phase on your own turn, so you can ignore them for now. Looking at it this way, things become much clearer. They have 4 creatures, and you need to deal with all of them. You can tap one of them down with Icy Manipulator, and you need to do this before they can attack. Trying to tap a creature that's already tapped and attacking doesn't actually do anything. Then, once your opponent attacks, you can shock one of their remaining commandos and block the other 2. In this case, it doesn't matter whether you shock first or block first, the outcome remains the same. But look, you lived! Now, things may look grim after that big attack from your opponent, but you never know. The card you draw next turn might be the one that changes everything.
And that is what makes Magic so engaging. So if you want to experience that feeling for yourself, you need to start playing. And the best way to do that is by downloading the digital version of the game, Magic the Gathering Arena. It's easy to get started and gives you immediate access to a bunch of simple tutorials where you can put all you've learned into practice. Then head over to your local game store to get your hands on some physical cards and start playing around the table with your friends. Good luck and have fun.